A couple of episodes ago, we established that the creedal framework critics use as a measuring stick for Christianity is a post biblical philosophical construction, using Greek categories imported into theology by councils, not by apostles. And in the last episode, we followed the evidence back to some of the oldest recoverable stories in the ancient world and found the same theological structure underneath all of them. Today, we're going to look at some of the physical manuscripts. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd tossed a rock into a cave on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea and accidentally made one of the most important archaeological discoveries in human history. When he went to retrieve the rock, what he found inside were ancient scrolls, hundreds of them. Biblical manuscripts more than 1,000 years older than anything scholars had previously worked from. The discovery was immediately hailed as proof that the Bible had been faithfully preserved across the centuries. And that's the headline that most people still remember. It got reported, it got preached, and most people absorbed it and moved on without reading any of the fine print. Well, I like the fine print, so that's what this episode is about. Now, when scholars actually compared those ancient manuscripts to the Bible that we have today, what they found was a bit more complicated. The texts actually don't always match, and sometimes in some pretty theologically significant places. The text showed that there wasn't one Bible being faithfully copied across the centuries. There were actually multiple manuscript traditions circulating simultaneously, preserving different readings and different theology. And at some point, someone, some person or people, made a decision about which one became authoritative. Eugene Ulrich, a Catholic priest and professor of Hebrew Scripture at Notre Dame, who served as a senior editor on the Scrolls publication project, put it this way. The Dead Sea Scrolls give us the Bible before the Bible. One text arrived at the finish line and got standardized. The others were pushed aside. So, the question was never, do the scrolls confirm the Bible? The real question is, which Bible? Here's why that even matters. Some of the manuscript traditions that the scrolls preserve turn out to read more like the Book of Mormon than the Bible that you probably have. Not at every place, but in quite a few verifiable and documented places. And just remember that Joseph Smith published the Book of Mormon in 1830, 117 years before anyone found those caves and those ancient texts. As always, the scholars that I cite in this episode are drawn mostly from outside the LDS faith, whenever possible. Today, we'll mainly be using an Orthodox Jewish scholar, a Catholic priest, and a Protestant biblical scholar whose peer-reviewed work that we'll cover was published in the Journal of Dallas Theological Seminary. So definitely not people trying to show LDS theology as being correct. Don't let your argument require all of them to be wrong. Before we go, just a quick thank you to everyone supporting the channel in all of the different ways. I appreciate how patient everyone has been during this transition to a real production, and I hope to keep growing this channel. If you want to show your support by donating to the channel, feel free to find my Ko-Fi and PayPal links in the channel description, but please never feel obligated. You can also help tremendously just by liking the video and sharing it with someone that might need to hear this information. Now, let's talk about what you know and what you don't know about the Dead Sea Scrolls. As always, all of my sources are down below in the pinned comment. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni's Standard. So, what exactly are the Dead Sea Scrolls, and why does it matter which Bible they confirm? The Dead Sea Scrolls are a collection of approximately 900 manuscripts discovered beginning in 1947 in caves near Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. The manuscripts date from roughly 250 BC to 68 AD, making this the oldest surviving collection of biblical texts ever found. Before 1947, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscript that scholars had access to was the Leningrad Codex, completed in 1008 AD. That's the manuscript underlying the King James Version, the NIV, and the ESV. Now, for starters, the Bible that those ancient scrolls were being compared to is itself a standardized product, produced by Jewish scribes called the Masoretes, who worked between approximately the 6th and 10th centuries AD. But Moses is traditionally dated to around 1400 BC. So you're basically looking at roughly 2,400 years between the events that the text describes and the people who decided what the text officially says. Emanuel Tov, the Orthodox Jewish scholar who ran the Dead Sea Scrolls publication project for 20 years and professor emeritus at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, established in his definitive work, Textual Criticism of the Hebrew Bible, that approximately 40% of the biblical manuscripts at Qumran represent traditions other than what the Masoretes actually standardized. The Masoretes didn't recover a pristine original version. They simply selected one of the several competing traditions and elevated it to exclusive authority. Someone will inevitably note that 60% of the scrolls still match the Bible, and technically that's true. But the 40% that doesn't match isn't then spread randomly across different inconsequential passages. It includes theologically significant readings, including in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, where the variant doesn't just change a word, but actually removes an entire cosmological framework from the text. The raw percentage really matters a lot less than where the variants appear. And where they appear, in several cases, is exactly where the Book of Mormon happens to diverge from the King James Version. So then, where specifically do the scrolls differ, and why does it matter? The variations run from minor scribal differences to divergences that substantively change what a passage says. To me, there are two examples that stand above the rest. The first is in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 8, that we just touched on. If you've been watching this channel, you know the divine counsel already. We've established it from the Hebrew text and the Ugaritic literature in earlier episodes. But for anyone new, it's the very well documented ancient Near Eastern theology in which God presides over other divine beings, attested to in Psalm 82, Job 1, and multiple other Hebrew Bible passages that have never been seriously disputed. Your Bible likely reads that when God divided the nations, he set their borders according to the number of the sons of Israel. But the Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript for Q Deuteronomy, along with the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation that Paul quoted, translated in Alexandria centuries before the Masoretic standardization, reads, according to the number of the sons of God. The sons of God reading of this verse places it inside the divine council cosmology. Yahweh is assigning divine beings to oversee each nation and retaining Israel for himself directly. But the sons of Israel reading removes that cosmology entirely. So the question is, which reading is original? And the answer comes from a basic principle of textual criticism. When two independent manuscript witnesses agree against a third, then the reading that they share is generally considered more original. The Dead Sea Scrolls came from the Judean desert, and the Septuagint was translated in Alexandria, Egypt. These traditions didn't copy from each other, so the fact that they agree on sons of God against the Masoretic sons of Israel is exactly the convergent testimony that textual critics look for when they're recovering an original reading. Michael Heiser, whose peer-reviewed article on this variant was published in Bibliotheca Sacra, the Journal of Dallas Theological Seminary, made this very case in detail, minus the LDS connection. Someone changed the text, period. But the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint still preserve what was there before. The second example is in Psalm 22:16. This is the psalm that opens with the words that Jesus quotes from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The text describes a figure whose hands and feet are affected, whose garments are divided by lot, and who is mocked. Now, the Masoretic text reads in a way that most translators render as, like a lion, my hands and feet. I don't know about you, but that feels pretty grammatically awkward, with no clear verb, and then the sentence just stops. However, the Septuagint reads, they pierced my hands and my feet. And the Dead Sea Scroll fragments support the pierced reading as well. The Septuagint Psalms were translated from a Hebrew original in approximately the 2nd century BC, which was centuries before the Masoretic standardization. So, the fact that the Septuagint independently reads pierced means that the change happened in the Hebrew tradition sometime after that translation diverged. Now, the two Hebrew letters that differ between the readings, being Yod and Vav, are certainly visually similar enough that an accidental error is theoretically possible. But an accidental error still doesn't explain why both the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments independently preserve the older reading against the standardized text. The direction of this change follows the same pattern as Deuteronomy 32. It moves consistently away from theological specificity, consistently in the Masoretic text, and consistently reversed in the earlier witnesses. So, now what does this have to do with the Book of Mormon? And how do we know that Joseph wasn't just using a different translation? The Book of Mormon contains large blocks of Isaiah text that is attributed to Nephi's copying from the brass plates, the scriptural archive that his family carried out of Jerusalem around 600 BC. Now, if you're new to this, don't be afraid to go back and listen again, but the brass plates predate the post exilic scribal consolidation that produced the Masoretic text. Josiah's reform began in 621 BC, and the full project of reshaping and standardizing the Deuteronomistic history extended through the Babylonian exile and beyond. So, an archive like the brass plates, taken from Jerusalem in 600 BC, should represent a snapshot mid process, showing the time frame after the reform began, but before the post exilic consolidation was complete. The Qumran community, for their part, deliberately sought out and preserved older manuscript traditions as a part of their opposition to the Jerusalem establishment, because their entire identity was built around preserving what they believed the corrupt official priesthood had abandoned. So, both the brass plates and the Qumran manuscripts were drawn from the same pre reformed textual pool. The scriptural tradition that existed before Josiah's editorial program was able to finish reshaping it. So that's the mechanism happening here. Not that the Book of Mormon was copied from the scrolls, but that both of them drew from the manuscript traditions that existed before the Masoretic editorial program did its work. The Isaiah passages in the Dead Sea Scrolls differ from the King James Version in hundreds of places. Donald Perry, a professor of Hebrew at BYU, who has served as associate editor of the Dead Sea Scrolls Isaiah volumes, published by Oxford University Press, not BYU, documented the many specific variants and then compared them systematically to the manuscripts. And some of the Book of Mormon's departures from the King James Version do in fact align with the Great Isaiah Scroll, also known as 1Q Isaiah A, which is a complete copy of Isaiah dating to approximately 100 BC. Not word for word, but much closer than the Masoretic text than the King James translators used. Royal Skousen, who's also LDS, if you're curious, who wrote the multi-volume analysis of textual variants of the Book of Mormon, which is the definitive scholarly treatment of the text, corroborated all of this completely independently. Now, Isaiah chapter 2, verse 16 is the clearest example. The King James Version reads, "And upon all pleasant pictures." The Book of Mormon reads, "And upon all the ships of the sea, and upon all the ships of Tarshish." The Great Isaiah Scroll and the Septuagint both preserve additional text in this verse that ends up aligning more closely with the Book of Mormon. Pleasant Pictures ends up translating a Hebrew term that appears nowhere else in the Old Testament, and translators have always struggled with it. But the older manuscripts don't have that problem. The Book of Mormon doesn't either. That is the point that illustrates what makes the meaningful alignments meaningful. They always tend to occur at points where the Masoretic text has a known difficulty, like a hapax legomenon, an unusual phrasing, or a reading scholars have long questioned. They always cluster at the problem spots, which is not what you would find from one text copying errors from another, but it is precisely what you'd expect from older common source. The natural objection is simply that Joseph used a different English translation, but scholars have tested that, and the Book of Mormon's variations don't map onto any English translation that was available in 1830, like the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible, and the Reims Douay. None of them can account for the specific variant pattern. Now, the Thompson Septuagint had been published in English in 1808, but was a rare scholarly production with approximately 1,000 copies made to stay in Europe, no documented connection to Joseph Smith, and the Book of Mormon doesn't simply follow the Septuagint anyway. It ends up agreeing with it against the King James Version in some places, with the King James Version against the Septuagint in others, and it diverges from both in other places. Again, that's not what copying from any single source looks like. A fabricator in 1830 would likely introduce changes that look like what they are: modernized phrasing, theological clarifications, and smoothed awkward passages. What you definitely would not do is accidentally reproduce readings from manuscripts that you'd never seen that happen to land precisely at the places where the textual critics have always identified difficulties. Again, not every Book of Mormon Isaiah variation matches the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of them are unique, and Perry and Skousen and other LDS scholars say so openly. But the argument isn't universal confirmation, it's simply that the pattern doesn't fit fabrication. The Great Isaiah Scroll was discovered in 1947, and the Book of Mormon was published in 1830. Joseph Smith was dead by 1844. I'll leave the math to you. So, who produced the Dead Sea Scrolls and what were they preserving? The manuscripts themselves were almost certainly produced by the Essenes, a Jewish sect that separated from the Jerusalem temple establishment in the mid 2nd century BC, following a dispute over the high priesthood. The legitimate priestly lineage ran through Zadok, the high priest under Solomon. But that line was displaced when the Hasmonean dynasty, the Maccabees, assumed the high priesthood after their military victories. The Hasmoneans were Levitical priests from the Joarib family. They were legitimate priests, but not from the Zadokite line that had traditionally held the high priesthood since Solomon. That distinction mattered enormously for communities where priestly lineage was the very basis of religious authority. And the Essenes understood themselves as preservers of that displaced Zadokite tradition, which is why Lawrence Schiffman, a Jewish scholar at NYU with no LDS affiliation, argues in Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Essenes represent a genuine ancient strand of priestly Judaism, rather than a fringe group. They weren't creating new theology, they were preserving older theology that the new establishment had displaced. Sound familiar? Anyway, in 68 AD, Roman forces destroyed Qumran, and before they arrived, someone sealed the library in clay jars and hid it in the surrounding caves. But the Essenes themselves didn't survive as a distinct movement. The rabbinic tradition that was reconstituted after the temple's destruction in 70 AD was then built by the Pharisees, not the Essenes, which also meant that the theology the Essenes had been preserving, like divine council cosmology, direct prophetic revelation outside the established priesthood, and the structured ritual rites involving covenants and garments as markers of purity status, wasn't carried forward. The textual evidence for each of these is pretty specific as well. For example, the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice describes angelic beings worshiping in a heavenly temple in language that directly reflects the divine council framework that the Deuteronomistic reform had been working to suppress centuries earlier. The community rule, designated 1QS, and one of the first scrolls identified from Cave 1, describes elaborate initiation rites, covenant ceremonies, and purity requirements organized around explicit levels of access and communal commitment, a ritual structure that scholars of ancient religion have compared directly to the mystery tradition pattern documented all across the ancient world. The Essenes weren't just preserving idiosyncratic sectarian theology. They were actually preserving the same pre reform framework that Josiah's scribes had been working to remove from the official text. But both preservation streams were eventually cut off. The Essenes by Rome in 68 AD, and the broader manuscript plurality by the Masoretic standardization. But what was lost was real and ancient. Now, how does the physical manuscript evidence connect to Josiah's scribes? The Dead Sea Scrolls wonderfully add physical evidence of deliberate editing to an argument that was only previously built from textual analysis. Here's what I mean. The Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8 change from sons of God to sons of Israel is not just similar looking letters being confused. The Hebrew words Bene Elohim and Bene Israel share no letters, and changing one to the other is not a scribal accident. It's an intentional substitution that removes a specific theological concept and then replaces it with a reading that has no actual cosmological implication. The scrolls preserve the older reading. The Masoretic text preserves the revision. And Josiah's reforms, the systematic restructuring documented in 2 Kings 22 and 23 that I've established across the channel in depth and confirmed by Frank Moore-Cross, Martin Noth, and Margaret Barker, set the trajectory for this kind of editing. The scrolls simply confirmed all of this in physical form. They didn't somehow create the argument. Now, remember that Lehi left Jerusalem approximately 600 BC, 21 years after Josiah's reform began. While that program was still being consolidated and the major post-exilic scribal work was still decades away. The brass plates represent a relative snapshot mid process. When the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve readings that align with what the Book of Mormon contains, what that's confirming is that both the brass plates tradition and the Qumran tradition independently preserved readings from before the editing was finished, seemingly always at the problem spots and always at the places where the Masoretic text shows signs of the editorial invention that came later. So, we're looking at two separate ancient manuscript streams carrying the pre standardization content forward through completely different channels. One just ended up in desert caves in Israel, while the other one ended up in an 1830 publication by a farmer in upstate New York. Now, I want to add something here that's outside of the scholarly argument. I spent years before I ever joined this church or was even seriously considering it, following a pattern in the ancient evidence. And the same pattern kept showing up in traditions that had no contact with each other. To be clear, the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't necessarily vindicate any of my personal beliefs, but what they did was confirm that the pattern I've been recognizing across my own years of study was real, and that it wasn't some personal projection. There really are physical manuscripts that were hidden away in desert caves for 2,000 years, preserving exactly the theological content that the pattern said should have been there to begin with. You can argue from your own personal feelings or emotions, but this is an evidentiary case, and the evidence stands. Now let's get into what the critics say and which objections actually hold up. The most serious objection is the Isaiah authorship question. If chapters 40 through 55 were actually written during the Babylonian exile, then Nephi couldn't have them when he left Jerusalem in 600 BC. That's totally open, and I want to acknowledge it honestly. But the critical case for Deutero-Isaiah ultimately rests on a single philosophical premise that Isaiah couldn't have named Cyrus before Cyrus existed because predictive prophecy is impossible. So if you grant that premise, then the argument follows. But if you don't, then it doesn't. The Great Isaiah Scroll contains all 66 chapters as a single unified document with no manuscript break indicating different authorship. So, if the ancients themselves recognized the division between two separate authors, the physical evidence doesn't reflect it. And non LDS scholars, including John Goldingay at Fuller Theological Seminary, Brevard Childs at Yale, and John Oswalt at Wesley Biblical Seminary, have argued for Isaiah unity on literary, theological, and canonical grounds that don't require resolving the predictive prophecy question. The whole debate is still live. Now, the less serious and more easily understood objection is just to minimize the variance. Critics try to argue that they're minor and theologically insignificant, and some are, but the argument here isn't that every variant matters. It's that specific, identifiable, and theologically important variants exist, with Deuteronomy chapter 32 and Psalm chapter 22 being the clearest. And their pattern in relation to the Book of Mormon can't really be explained by coincidence or any actual source that Joseph Smith could have accessed. As for the bias objection and the Heiser objection, for those of you that don't like when I use him, take a look at Perry's role on the Oxford University Press Scrolls publication, which was earned on the basis of expertise and not faith. And the manuscripts are publicly digitized, meaning that anyone can check the comparisons for themselves. Heiser documented what the Hebrew text says, and then his personal theological conclusions are separate from the textual findings. I cite the scholarship because the scholarship is sound. Tov's 40% figure, Heiser's documentation of the Sons of God reading, and Mark Smith's independent documentation of the Divine Council through Ugaritic texts at Princeton are all samples of findings that existed in the scholarship before anyone like me applied them. My personal application doesn't change the data, and none of this is an exhaustive list. This is all just another layer of a pattern that runs considerably deeper. So, what is the actual LDS claim today, and does the evidence support it? The actual LDS claim is not that the Dead Sea Scrolls prove the Book of Mormon is true. The claim is that a consistent pattern exists in which LDS scripture preserves ancient textual and theological content only confirmed by scholarship after Joseph Smith's death. All of this being content that he had no mechanism to access, and this pattern being inconsistent with fabrication and consistent with translation from genuine ancient sources. On the textual side of things, we see specific variants in the Book of Mormon's Isaiah passages that align with manuscript traditions that were in desert caves until 1947, clustering at Masoretic problem spots in exactly the pattern you'd expect from a pre-standardization source. Not randomly and not in ways attributable to any 1830 English translation, but at the places where the Masoretic text shows signs of editorial invention. And on the theological side, the scrolls confirm a picture of pre standardization Israelite theology that matches what the Book of Mormon describes pretty specifically. In 1 Nephi chapter 1 verse 8, Lehi sees God on his throne surrounded by a council of divine beings. He saw the heavens open, and he thought he saw God sitting upon his throne, surrounded with numberless concourses of angels, in the attitude of singing and praising their God. That's not your typical Christian monotheism where God is solitary and incorporeal. It's divine council cosmology, the same framework that was presented in the Qumran literature, and the same framework attested in the Sons of God reading of Deuteronomy that the Masoretic editors replaced. So the brass plates carried out of Jerusalem around 600 BC preserve that same theological architecture that the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve and that Josiah's scribes were in the process of suppressing. That's a perfect structural match between a Book of Mormon passage, a Dead Sea Scrolls manuscript tradition, and a documented pattern of deliberate biblical editing. The evidentiary logic is plain from where I'm sitting. The significance isn't just that two sources share similar theology, it's that the path from that theology to Joseph Smith in 1830 only runs through ancient sources that he could not have accessed. In 1830, there was no existing scholarly framework connecting divine council cosmology, pre reformed manuscript traditions, and specific textual variants in Isaiah. The scholars who would document those connections were not yet born, or were not yet doing that work, or were working on manuscripts still buried in desert caves. Joseph couldn't have reverse engineered this convergence because the intellectual tools to construct it didn't even exist. Now, that's not a claim that the Book of Mormon is true, but it's a claim that the fraud theory requires Joseph to have accidentally and coincidentally produced a document whose specific features only became explicable through scholarship conducted well after his death. Neither the textual evidence nor the theological parallels alone constitute proof, but together as part of a cumulative pattern that keeps getting confirmed by post 1830 discoveries, they definitely constitute a serious evidentiary problem for the fraud theory that hasn't yet been adequately answered. To wrap everything up today, the Dead Sea Scrolls don't confirm the Bible. They actually confirm that there were multiple Bibles. The popular story from 1947 was just a summary. But the actual scholarship tells a much more complicated story, and the complications consistently point in the same direction. The Book of Mormon's Isaiah variants seem to cluster at Masoretic problem spots and then align with manuscripts that Joseph Smith couldn't have ever seen. The Divine Council framework, suppressed by Josiah's editorial program, is preserved in the Dead Sea Scrolls and then reflected in the Book of Mormon's theology, in readings that match pre-standardization manuscripts that neither Joseph nor his critics knew existed. So again, we see two separate ancient manuscript streams independently carrying pre-reform content forward. For LDS members watching this, the next time someone tells you that the Dead Sea Scrolls proved biblical preservation and made restoration unnecessary, ask them which Bible. The Masoretic text that was standardized 1,000 years after the prophets, or the older traditions that the scrolls actually preserve. Ask them specifically about Deuteronomy chapter 32 verse 8, and ask them to explain the Isaiah chapter 2 verse 16 variant. You're not claiming that the scrolls prove the restoration. You're pointing out that they remove one of the cleaner lines of attack that critics have been using, but the evidence keeps pointing the other way. For skeptics watching, the Isaiah authorship question is a real one, and I've even said so. But the variant alignment isn't universal, and I've said that too. What I'd simply ask is whether the picture you're working with is really an honest one. There's a version of the Joseph Smith critique that says he invented a theology with no ancient precedent, then fabricated a text that contradicts everything scholars knew, and also created something so foreign to the ancient world that it can only be explained as a 19th century American invention. The big problem with that picture is that it requires completely ignoring a documented and accumulating scholarly record that keeps pointing in the other direction. You don't have to agree with the LDS conclusion, but if the case against Joseph Smith depends on denying what the ancient manuscripts actually show, or caricaturing Joseph as a con man, then I just really encourage you to take a closer look. And for anyone who arrived here and you're just curious about what Latter day Saints actually believe, we're not asking you to accept the restoration because of this scholarship. We're just asking you to look honestly at what the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal about the history of the text that you likely call scripture. To recognize that it went through an editorial process, that multiple traditions existed, and that older manuscript traditions sometimes read differently from the Bible that you have, and then to consider what it might mean that a 19th century publication keeps landing on the right side of those differences. I'm just here to show you the evidence, and we think that this is where it leads. Go see for yourself. All of my sources are in the pinned comment below. I'm Alex Arnold, and this is Moroni's Standard.